Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts, Story Edition. I'm excited to be joined today with a friend, colleague, and somebody that I met in the social media world, Cait West. I'll tell you a little bit more about her in just a moment, but I am excited for her to join us today as she shares with us not only a little bit more about her story of growing up in the Christian Patriarchy and stay-at-home daughters movement, but she's also sharing with us about her book, her memoir, Rift, which I'm so excited about because it is absolutely excellent. And if you haven't had a chance to read it or to listen to it, I would highly recommend that you do so. It is available wherever you buy books, including your local bookstore, or you can request it at your library, and you can listen to it on Audible as it's read by Cait herself. So we are going to get into that interview in just a moment, but like we say every episode, we do know that sometimes the topics that we discuss in any episode may bring up feelings, emotions, and triggers that might require more processing or might feel like just too much to handle right now. So please always feel free to skip any episode or parts of episodes and come back when you're ready. Our goal is to help you trust your own body and lived experience so that you can take what you need and leave what you don't. Cait West is an author, podcaster, and speaker. Her work focuses on exposing the Christian patriarchy movement, including the sub-movement of the stay-at-home daughters. Cait herself was a stay-at-home daughter until the age of 25 when her questions and curiosity prompted her to leave and begin a life outside of these systems. Cait has since graduated from college, is well into her career, and has recently published her first book, Rift, a memoir breaking away from Christian patriarchy. As you'll hear in this interview and read in her book, writing her story has been a tool for her own healing and growth and understanding what happened to her inside the Christian patriarchy movement. Rift is available wherever you buy books and is also available on Audible, read by Cait herself. Recently, Cait and her story were featured on the short film For Our Daughters, which was created by Kristen Cobus-Dumais. For Our Daughters is a powerful new documentary highlighting how a culture of submission and sexual abuse in the evangelical church ties directly to the Christian nationalist quest to use the outcome of the 2024 elections to deprive all American women of basic democratic rights. For Our Daughters speaks to all women of faith, encouraging them to use their voices and their votes to ensure that their daughters will have the rights to health and happiness guaranteed to all Americans. For Our Daughters is available on YouTube. This film, along with all of Cait's information, will be linked in the show notes. So let's get into our talk with Cait West. Hello, Cait. Welcome to the Sunday School Dropouts podcast. It's so good to have you here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, Laura.
Yeah, I'm excited because we're going to be talking about your book, Rift. But before we get to that, or maybe kind of as a preamble to it, I wonder if you can just share with us a little bit about your background in the religion of origin that you grew up in, what it was like. And of course, we'll talk after that about how that inspired your book.
Sure, of course. So I was born into a conservative Christian family. My parents were Presbyterians at that point, and I had two older siblings and then eventually a younger sibling as well. And I grew up on the East Coast for the first half of my childhood and then moved to Colorado for the second half. And during that time, my parents went from a pretty typical conservative Presbyterian church to getting more and more radicalized in something called the Christian Patriarchy movement, which taught this theology that God is masculine, that patriarchy should be how family and society is run, and everything had that layer of this is what God wants you to do. And so I can see points in my life early on where the rules got stricter and my life got smaller. So when I was 5, I was going to kindergarten at a Christian school for a few months, and then my dad decided to homeschool me because that was becoming more and more popular with the more fundamentalist end of Christianity. And so I got pulled out of that and was homeschooled. So that was like the first big push for isolation. And then we got involved in this movement with things like Patriarch Magazine, which taught this kind of theology, and it's literally called that.
Wow.
And yeah, and it was very much like a grassroots movement. I think it was, there were certain leaders. Some of them are around, some of them aren't. So some of the people who are around still are Doug Wilson and Vodi Bakum. People who aren't around anymore are Doug Phillips from Vision Forum and Bill Gothard from IBLP, that they're all connected in this kind of ideology. So we got really indoctrinated into those teachings, and more and more my life became about how to be raised to be a wife and a mother, because I was a girl versus my brothers who were being trained to have jobs. And so everything was about that theology, and my life just became centered around, this is what it looks like to be a godly woman. And all sense of self was really shut down at that point.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think it's also so interesting how these groups that we now hear about, whether it's IBLP and Bill Gothard or Doug Wilson, Doug Phillips, like everything is so interconnected. And they all have the same end goal, which is, in this sense, control, really. I mean, if we're going to boil it down to it, control.
Right.
Yeah. I'm curious to know, and talk about this as much or as little as you want, because I do want people to go and buy your book. So I don't want to give like everything away. But I know you were homeschooled, and I can remember when I was reading your book here, your, was it your high school graduation where everybody's like saying, this is what we're going to do. Here's my next step. And you were saying, I'm going to essentially prepare to be a wife and a mother. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah. So I was homeschooled from, once I was pulled out of kindergarten all the way through 12th grade or whatever, my parents equated that to, because it was really up to them to limit whatever education they wanted to give me. And we had a homeschool graduation ceremony. So in Colorado, there's this organization called CHEC. It's called Christian Home Educators of Colorado. And so they throw a graduation ceremony. And so you think about it, everyone there is very conservative, very Christian. And in the bulletin, or like the program for the graduation ceremony, they had each student write a bit about what they hoped for the future. And I didn't realize till looking back later, but I was the only one out of all of these students who didn't have any kind of educational plans. So my dad mostly wrote that for me. And so, he was saying, this is what you're going to do. You're going to be a wife and a mother. Education, college was not part of that plan. And so even these other conservative girls were allowed to get some kind of college education. But for me, it was even more limited, which I didn't realize that at the time, because even the girls I knew who might take some college classes, we were still being told your main goal in life is to be a wife and a mother.
And can you share with people what the stay-at-home daughter movement is, and how, in your experience with that?
Yeah, so think about Christian patriarchy as like this bigger, broader ideology. The stay-at-home daughter part is this within that broader movement. So it's kind of like similar to the Quiverful movement, which the Duggars are famous for. The stay-at-home daughter thing, I'm not sure where that term originated, but I do know it was made popular by Vision Forum, which was an organization in Texas. I mentioned Doug Phillips. This was a ministry that taught that boys and girls have separate gender roles and they should be trained to be those kinds of adults. So it was really big in the homeschooling world. And they had like lots of toys. Like they would make, you could buy boomerangs for boys and teacups for girls. Like it was very much gender-based catalog for Christian families. And they started publishing books about girls staying home after they finished their homeschool education. So while boys might go to college or get, an apprenticeship or learn to have some kind of business, girls were trained to stay home and not go to college, not get a job, not pursue a career because their goal was to be a stay-at-home mom. And that's where the term stay-at-home daughter came from, where you are staying home as a daughter and learning how to fulfill that role, but your practice is with your father. So it's a really complicated, dysfunctional relationship. Some people use the term emotional incest and like this enmeshment of families where girls aren't allowed to grow up. They have to be like that perpetual child, but also be like this second wife to their father. So it's really not healthy. And I stayed home till I was 25 when I finally figured out a way to leave. And what I like to point out is that this term, stay-at-home daughter, isn't quite as popular anymore, but the lifestyle, the coercion of young women to stay home still exists. There are still stay-at-home daughters, even if they don't use that word, or you might not recognize them because they might blend in with the broader Christian world. So yeah, it's really problematic.
I remember, I think I'm a few years older than you. So like when the stay-at-home daughters movement was coming about, like it never was mainstream, but when it became more churches, even not even necessarily like those a part of the IBLP or, things like that were highly affiliated with those other parachurch organizations. I was already graduated from high school, but I remember hearing about this and feeling I don't know if jealousy is the right word, but maybe almost like a sense of sadness that like that hadn't been my path, because I thought, I've been told I'm supposed to be this wife and this mother. That's it. I have maybe a little bit of education, but really not much because I don't need much. Because why would I? And I just remember feeling a sense of sadness that had not been offered to me and was still not an option. But then on the flip side, I was taught that then the way I had to learn how to submit was just to submit to every single man around me.
Right.
All the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, they were like, that's just how you can practice. And then a man will see your submissive attitude and he'll want to marry you. And it never happened. But, that's a whole other story.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, and even now, there's this trend on TikTok called the stay-at-home girlfriend. It's kind of like trad wife or, the stay-at-home daughter even. Sometimes people use that term, where it's just young women who are saying through their content that they don't want to work and they want to be financed through this whatever relationship it is. And they're portraying it as this like very comfortable lifestyle, but it's so different from what we experienced because we were being coerced into it and told we didn't have any other options. And so on the one side, that idea of what's it called? Benevolent patriarchy, where you're being told this is good for you. You don't have to work. You don't have to go out in the world. You can be safe at home. You can learn how to sew and cook and have a comfortable life. That's not what reality was like because you didn't have any choices in that. And so when your agency is taken away, it's not comfortable anymore because you're basically being a servant to whoever's whims that you have to follow.
Yeah. That choice piece, that's what always gets you. If you don't have choice, is it really, I mean, it sounds cliche. Is it really a choice, right? Like when there's no other options. Yeah, right. I very much understand that. Yeah. So you alluded to not being able to get out of it or first being able to realize that maybe there's other options around the age of 25. Can you just share a little bit about that, what we could call it an escape or leaving, what led up to that and how did that happen?
Yeah. So, I was told the way I was going to leave my family was when I got married. And my father was going to help me find that person through this process called courtship. So because, quote unquote, dating is practice for divorce, we had to practice this very strict form of courtship where the father almost picks the husband out. And there's this facade of choice for the women. But really, again, it's coercion, right? So I went through, I say 1.5 courtships because the second one ended very differently from the first one. My first courtship was very long and drawn out, and I was trying to follow all the rules and obey my father and go through this whole process, which included all these questions and, conversations with my dad and this guy. It was never us one-on-one. It was always like the three of us. And my dad decided to end this relationship. And I talk about that in the book, so I don't want to get too deep into it. But for me, the impact was this realization, one, that I had no choice over who I was going to be in a relationship, that my dad could just pull that away, and my whole life trajectory could change based on my father. And then also realizing I cared about this person, and that was not allowed, because on top of the sexual purity piece of purity culture, there's the emotional purity piece, where I was told you can't have affection for someone that you're not committed to marry. So I got in trouble for love. And that's really when my intuition started to kick in, because I was like, that can't be true. Like, I think it was risky to even think that thought, that my dad might be wrong about that. But that's eventually what led me to leave, is that inner voice, that sense of something isn't right here. And so when that courtship ended, I was 21. So looking back, I was so young and thinking I could just get married and whatever.
Yeah.
And I made this commitment to myself that I would never let my dad destroy another relationship if I wanted to, if I cared about the person. And so I still stayed home. I still submitted to my dad. I didn't really have any other options. When you're a stay-at-home daughter, you don't have a lot of financial resources and all sorts of things. I didn't have education. I lived on an island at the time in Hawaii, so it wasn't like I could just drive away. And then I fell in love with somebody else. And my dad said yes to a courtship for 1 week and then changed his mind. And that's when that old promise to myself came back. And I was like, I'm not going to let this happen again. I really care about this person, and this person cares about me. And I'm not going to let that just go away because of my dad's arbitrary whims. That's what, at that point, I was realizing this does not feel like he has my best interests at heart, or he's not, he's saying one thing, like, this is what love is. And then the results were not matching up. So that cognitive dissonance, that we talked about was really hitting me. And so that's the relationship that I had. This, it was somewhat secretive because we were kind of dating, but we weren't allowed to talk about it because then I would get in trouble with my dad. And going through that process of falling in love, but also trying to keep it secret and trying to be safe and feeling unsafe at home and trying to save up money. So I was allowed to teach piano lessons. That was the loophole I found to get some resources. And so the relationship plus the finances piece, plus being 25 years old and thinking I really want my own life. All those things started to come together at that time. And I found the means to leave. So it's a long story, but for me, it's so cliche to say I followed my heart, but in some sense, that's what I'm trying to say is my emotions, I had been taught they were so evil. And it wasn't until I realized that was a lie that I could leave a bad situation. Because when you're being told that abuse is love, you will sit with that forever if you don't trust yourself to know what's right and wrong.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much in there. I think it's so interesting, talking about this idea of we've been sold this like these messages of like, this is what life or relationships or love or whatever is going to be like. And then, of course, anything outside of that is bad and dirty and evil and wrong. And if you engage in it, you're going to feel it for sure. That'll be the Holy Spirit convicting you. And I feel like it's more common than people even let on that sometimes the most confusing part is that it doesn't feel bad and evil and wrong and going like, wow, I'm in this case, like following my heart, or I'm doing this thing that I wasn't supposed to do and was supposed to bring me so much guilt and conviction. And yet that's the most free I've ever felt, or that's the most like me I've ever felt. And it's like one of those moments where you're like, I don't think like, I can't deny that. Like this lived experience isn't sinful. It's like fully me. And, it's like you cannot go back to the old way of living.
Yeah, and I think that's why high control groups try to control your emotions so much, because if you're disconnected from your emotions and your intuition, then you're much easier to control than someone who's in charge of their own life.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. For sure. Yeah. There was something else you said that made me remember, as you're describing like courtship, and it's basically like, the father picking out, or well, maybe the mother too, but kind of there's this whole process to it. And I know what it was, your feelings were involved in it, right? Like you said, you cared about somebody. And it reminded me of Passion and Purity, Jim and Elizabeth Elliot's story, and how she wrote about that. And I think it was in that book, but she talks about how both of them were like, we're not really attracted to each other, but we're like basically praying that we would be, and that we would be attracted to who Christ is in each other. And that's who we're marrying, is Christ in each other. And I have heard that said from many people after that, like after having read that. I remember thinking that was the greatest love story ever. And now it just seems so cold, and it seems so opposite of what a healthy and connective and loving relationship is. And it's so interesting to me that like you knew that inherently. That didn't even have to be taught to you. You just knew it inherently in your body and in your heart.
Yeah. And I think I had to, there's all these like layers of not getting to that part of me, to that core self of understanding. There's all these layers of what I was told the Bible means, what my dad says, what my pastor says. And it took a while to dig down and like really listen to what my intuition was saying. And like that, it's interesting you bring up that book. I definitely read that book, and Elizabeth Elliot was one of the approved authors, and I think it's hard for me to go to that place where I think about all the women who are getting into relationships, and men who are getting into relationships based on this other person is a Christian. They believe the same kind of doctrine. Like that's basically what we were told. Like if you believe the same things and you have the right body parts, then you can be compatible for marriage, for life. Yeah. And then there is no escape from that. There is no second like plan B, right? And that's really sad to me, is like you're basing a relationship on a belief system or what your pastor or your father says you should believe. And then people change, right? Or you're oppressed to begin with. You get into a relationship and realize you're not that person after all. And so I've seen that happen a lot. And I think that partly is maybe why I made certain decisions, is because for me being 25, I was kind of like the spinster, to be honest.
Oh, sure.
Like in this community,
absolutely.
A lot of girls got married like 18, 19, 20. And so I had been to a lot of weddings. I'd seen a lot of my friends get married. And I think I had a lot of time to think about what that would mean for me. And so in some ways, I just think it was just like, the draw of the cards in some ways.
Yeah. As you were, at age 25, and you're kind of having this like existential experience almost like with your relationships, was there other parts of your faith or religion that you were also starting to question as you were kind of leaving that system?
Yeah, I think everyone's personal faith journey or spirituality is so unique to them. And I think it's so easy to put people into these little boxes of like, this is when you're an evangelical and this is when you're an ex-evangelical. And my experience of that was this whole long process that I think I'm still in. I started having doubts about whether God existed when I was a kid. And I was afraid of that. I thought that meant, oh, that means I'm a really bad person. And so my whole adolescence, I was struggling with this like sense of I'm a really bad person. I need to figure out how to have a better faith. And going through this whole thing with my dad and leaving my family, it was interesting that I was starting to separate God is different from my father. And I think that was conflated in this movement on purpose of, we were told your dad is God's representative. He's responsible for you, or your husband, depending if you're married or unmarried. And, so pleasing my father and submitting to my father was the same as obeying God. And so once I started to break away from my dad, I was trying to pull those things apart, and I stopped believing that if there was a God, that God was patriarchal. And so from that point, I just dropped all of that sense of God is, the way I was taught who God was. And I think I held on to certain parts of faith during that really comforted me. And I think that's a lot of people's experience of certain Bible verses or stories in the Bible that give you a sense of peace, like there's something outside of yourself that's going to look after you when you feel alone. Because I was, there was points when I was kind of suicidal and I felt so alone. And so there was a sense of comfort that there was a God who loved me. And that was different from the way I had been taught about God.
Sure.
So I think in some ways my faith helped me leave my independent faith, right? Not the religion part. And then I wanted to keep going to church for a while. And once I left my family, I did go to a church, and I thought it was a safer church, and that turned out not to be the case. And it was heartbreaking to go through that in a different way as an adult and realize church leaders don't care about abuse victims the way they should. At least a lot of them don't. I'm not going to say everyone. And they don't, especially the way women are treated in the church. It was devastating for me to realize that this is so much more than just my family and than this movement that I was part of. It's a lot of churches. And at the same time, I had access to more information. I started going to college and reading a lot of books and exploring spirituality in a different way. And it felt to me not like I lost something, but that I just let go of certain beliefs. And a lot of those core beliefs of Christianity just kind of felt like I let go of them. And they didn't mean the same things to me anymore. And so I'm pretty transparent about being agnostic at this point. But there's been times in my life when religion, that sense of faith helped me, and also when it hurt me. And so I think it's very complicated. But yeah, so now looking back, I'm in a different place now than I was when I left. And I think I still needed to hold on to some of those things just to have a sense of familiarity.
I think that's so common. I mean, I know there are people that would say, I let everything go all at once, and I think with people that are coming out of high control religions and fundamentalism where you're taught like it's all or nothing, that's pretty common then to say, okay, it's either all or nothing, and I'm letting go of everything. But I think even more often though is what I'm hearing from your story, and I know that was my experience too, of going, I have to give myself permission to let go at the pace that I need to let go at, if ever, and I remember thinking, if God is all knowing, then there's no question I can ask or door I can walk through where God's going to be like, oh shit, didn't see that one coming, and that was what I needed to hold on to, that I could, like have that as like my safety buffer, until I didn't need that anymore. But I think I really appreciate what you're saying is like, it isn't always just you wake up one morning and I'm good. It is oftentimes a process of grief and slow, painful decisions and examination. And that doesn't necessarily stop. Sometimes it continues to happen for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, I think a big piece of that is personal agency. I think I grew up in this world where my personal agency was just stripped away. I had no choices. And then deciding what I believed and having the safe space to do that is part of me finding my agency and my voice again and deciding what do I believe? What does seem true to me? And that's why I always try to talk about this, because so many of the people that I talk with, survivors of abuse, they want to know that they can believe what they believe and it's okay.
Yeah.
And I just want to say, you own yourself. You belong to you. You get to decide what you believe, and no one else can take that away from you. And there is no one right path. That's kind of where we came from, is this one right path to salvation. Now there's not just another right path to follow to get away from that. There's many different ways to live and to access your sense of spirituality. So I just want other survivors to know that they can do that. You have permission to do that. Not that I can give permission.
Sure. I get that. Yeah. When you think about your own kind of journey of healing, what are some of the things that have been important for you, in the last, since you've left, since you've started taking steps away from that?
Yeah, I think when I first left, it was little things like, what nail polish color do I like? Do I like wearing makeup? What kind of jewelry do I like? That sounds so, it sounds so surface level, but that was what felt safe to me.
Yes.
Was personal expression and how I wanted to show up in the world. And, because when you're so controlled, you don't really have a lot of options around that. And so at first was making decisions about that. And that is exhausting when you've not made those kinds of decisions before. Yeah. Like having to take care of myself and learn, like I moved to Michigan from Hawaii, like, oh, now I live in a place with winter. I need to get winter boots and a coat, and I need to get a job to pay for that. And all of those things that I learned later in life. But now, I think I've learned a lot of those things. I've found more stability. I've been through a lot of trauma therapy and learning how to regulate my nervous system and feel more safe within myself. And now I understand more of how I need multiple resources to have a healthy life. So, I think of before when I had this one kind of religion and this one kind of family, and that was like my only source of strength or help in the world. And then I lost it and I felt so untethered from the world. And now my friend Catherine Spearing, Catherine. She talks about community diversification, like having many different things that feed into your life so that if one thing is not as strong at that moment, you have other things that can support you. So for me, that's a therapist, that's friendship, that's a job that I enjoy and that can, support me. And it's finding things that I love to do and spending time doing that instead of just only giving myself little moments of pleasure. That's one of my hardest things actually is I feel like I always need to have a reason to do something or to be productive or to save the world or do something that will make the world a better place. And the only thing that I can do that gets my thought out of that is reading fiction books. And so I'm trying to spend more and more time reading books for fun. It's always been a way for me to escape my anxiety. And so trying to take that seriously and not just say that happens if it happens, but my mental health is important and I need to spend time with it and not just let it be what it is.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I feel like books are such an integral part to so many people's process of healing, whether it was like the coping skill that you had access to as a kid, or some people reading themselves out of cults, or, like just being able to read about trauma and understand what's happening in their body. I've just found that over and over that so many of us have our lives because of books and because of, what that has offered us in terms of another world. And yeah.
And I think part of it's just like connecting with people who aren't like you or who are like you and just finding that human connection, especially when you come from a place where, like for me, I lost all trust in people when I left. Like not everyone, but most people. I was like, I don't know who to trust. I don't know what that looks like when you come from a place where your family's supposed to love you and then there's abuse in your home. It's hard to find trust. And so books were a safer way for me to find that kind of connection. And it's not the only connection. I do have people that I trust in my life. But I think sometimes it's just a safer way to explore feelings and
very much. Yeah. So on the note of books, I mentioned at the top here that, you have a book, and I'm curious to know if you'd share with our listeners how your background inspired your book.
And so, I went to college. I escaped this whole movement. I'm in my late 20s. All I wanted to do was go to college and learn things and explore the world. And I wanted to write fiction. And I started taking writing classes. A couple things happened. My writing program required you to take 2 genres to study. And so the options were fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. And I'm afraid of poetry, so I picked fiction and nonfiction.
I love it.
And, I tried writing about other things, but my story kept coming up every time I tried to write something about myself. I realized how interconnected where I came from was and how I saw myself and how I related to other people, even after leaving. And eventually I was like, okay, I'm just going to write it then because it keeps showing up. Because before that point, I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want anyone to know. I wanted to just pretend like I'd grown up differently.
Sure.
Not that I wanted to lie. I just didn't want to have to deal with it. And then I realized there's this story inside of me that needs to get out. And so I started writing it in college and trying to explain to my classmates and my professors what this world was like, which was an interesting experience because none of them understood. And so that helped me figure out how to explain these concepts in words that people outside of it might get. So that was really good. And at the same time, I started going to, after I graduated, I started going to trauma therapy and getting help. And that unlocked a lot of my ability to write about this too, because I could only go so far until I went through therapy, and then I could deal with it in a healthier way instead of just getting pulled back into the depression from the before times. And I wanted to tell my story and take my voice back. And for me, I had this visualization of taking the pen back to my own story because I had been told your life is going to look like this. And I wanted to be curious and decide who I am and what my life is going to look like now. So writing it was this creative way of expression and processing. I started sharing some things online, and that's when I realized that there were other people who felt this way, who had gone through these kinds of things, because before I didn't really realize how many people could relate to that. It was just a matter of finding them. And so when I heard more and more stories, that's when I realized I want to be more public about this. I think I want to turn this into a book for other people, not just for me. Yeah. I think both can be true. Like, I think it was important for me to write. And also my hope is that it can open up those conversations for other people too. But really, I love writing. I love being creative and finding ways to tell stories that can connect us to each other and find new ways of living. Yeah. And so it was a long process of writing the book. I wanted to tell my story, but I also wanted to do it in a different way. So the format's not quite a linear narrative that you might expect from a quote unquote normal memoir, but it's the way my brain works. Like, I think traumatic memory sometimes is in pieces. And so my book, there is that pieciness aspect to it. I hope it makes sense to most people, but the structure might be a little different than you expect.
Yeah. And feel free to not answer this if you want. We can cut it out if needed. But what inspired the title Rift?
It's so interesting because that has always been the title. Even since I started writing about this, I had a creative writing thesis, and it was just a few chapters that turned into this book. And it's always called Rift. And I think part of it was the one word I found that felt like it was simple enough and also expansive enough to explain how it felt to leave my family. Yeah. This separation. It was very much a physical separation for me. Like, I got on a plane and I moved to a different state and I had to start over. And also, it felt like there was this rift inside of myself, like this tearing apart of who I am and trying to figure out what that even means. And so the word helped explain that. And I was also writing about geology and the land that I've lived on and how that's really shaped how I see the world and where I see myself as belonging in the world is the places I am. And I wanted to incorporate geology into that. So one of my first essays that I wrote about this was talking about the Rocky Mountains and how the geology there has changed over time, because I was learning about evolution for the first time. So I was like fascinated by how the world has changed. And over so much time, it wasn't like quick change. And so I liked that idea of slow change and how there was a break that I had, but also there's this change from before and after. It's not quite as clean as we want it to be. It wasn't quite the clean break that the word rift might make you think of. And the more I explored this idea and the idea of a rift in geology, which is when two pieces of land pull apart and create this rift in the earth. And now I live in Michigan, where the Great Lakes, that was one of the biggest rifts in the world. And it didn't actually separate the continent as it might have. And so I think it's so interesting to explore that idea. I know I'm going on a nerdy rant.
It.
But for me, like, you can have two sides to something, but if you dig down on both sides, it's the same materials. Like, in a geological perspective, they're the same kinds of earth on both sides of the rift. They used to be together and now they're separate, and now they're going to evolve separately. At the same way I feel about my past. Like, my past is still a part of who I am. I can't pretend anymore that it doesn't exist. And the only way to move forward is to accept that. Just say, this is part of who I am. This is where I came from. And that's what's going to enable me to create something new by acknowledging that and trying to reckon with it.
Yeah, I love that. I just think it's fascinating and such a wonderful example or analogy of what this process truly is, for sure. So if you think about the audience that you're writing for, how is it that you hope they'll be impacted by this book?
Yeah, I really hope, when you're writing a book and you're trying to sell it to publishers, you think about the different audiences. And so my number one audience has always been other people who've survived similar situations, maybe not the exact same thing, but they've been through abuse at home or in church, and they feel alone. And so I wanted my first audience to be those people. I wanted to be able to say, this is what it felt like for me. Is it what it felt like for you too? Or how was it different? I wanted to have that kind of conversation with the reader. And because books have been so impactful for me, I wanted to give that back to other readers. Yeah. And so I hope that it helps them feel seen and validates their stories. I think sometimes when you go through this, especially with something as broad as like Christian patriarchy, there's not always a conclusion or resolution. There's that ambiguous sense of what even did I go through? Yeah. And people are afraid to even talk about it because it's like, was it even real? Like, am I just crazy for feeling this way? And I want to say, no, this is very much real. This is what happened. This is why you feel this way. It's harmful. And you are validated in having those feelings. You're not crazy. And I want them to feel that way and to be able to claim their own stories back. And the broader audience outside of that is, their loved ones and people who care about making this world less oppressive. I want us to understand more about how people get into these movements, how they leave, how we can be more compassionate and open up doors for people who don't even know what they need to get out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if there's a person who's listening who is just starting to ask questions or just taking that first step out, what piece of advice or word of wisdom or hope would you give them if they're just starting out on this healing journey?
I think just be patient with yourself. It's going to take some time to figure out what your life will be like. And it's so unsettling to go through it, this kind of transition from family or from faith or from whatever it is. There's always going to be grief in that process. And I think be patient with yourself. Don't be so hard on yourself. You're doing the best you can with the resources that you have. And just remember that there are so many people out here now who are speaking up about this. There are more people than you know in your community who also care. And it's just a matter of finding them and realizing you're not alone. I live in West Michigan, and I visited a book club the other day. And in Ottawa County in West Michigan, it's very conservative. We've even made the news for how Christian nationalism has taken over some of the government. And I met with this book club, it's like this group of ex-evangelical or agnostic women talking about these things and trying to find community with each other because it was so hard to find other people who felt the same way because it's such an evangelical area. And so sometimes it just means finding a group like that or starting a book club like that or a virtual community. You have to learn to trust yourself and take risks sometimes. And if the community that you're finding isn't right for you, it's okay to say, oh, that doesn't work for me. And that's part of that taking your agency back.
I love that. Awesome. Well, your book is called Rift. Where can people find it if they want to purchase it?
Yeah, anywhere. I mean, it's all major booksellers. You can find it on the internet. They're in some Barnes & Noble stores, local indie bookstores. I love recommending those.
Yes. Yeah.
And you can always request it from your library, which still helps authors when you do that. And there are different formats. So there's the hardcover, there's an ebook, and then I read the audiobook. So if you want to listen to it, that's a great way to do that too.
I love that. And where can people find you if they want to follow your work or get in touch with you? What's the best place?
Yeah, so I'm on, I think you could just Google me. You can find my website. I also have a Substack. That might be the best way to keep up with updates and news and events coming up that I'm doing. I have social media. It's at Cait West Writes. I spell my first name Cait. I like to explain that. And a couple other things. I have a podcast called Survivors Discuss with a couple friends, which you've been on.
Yes. Yeah.
And also, I was recently in a documentary called For Our Daughters, which is a very short 30-minute documentary about sexual abuse in the evangelical church. It's very relevant to the 2024 election, and so I'd recommend people go and watch that.
It's excellent. I absolutely love it. So yes, highly recommend, and recommend everything from you, whether it's your book, Substack, following you on social media, Cait, listening to the podcast. Cait puts out wonderful information, and I hope people follow along. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm really hopeful that your story just continues to go, like, to reach the ears of the people that need to be hearing it. Because I think that is what can change so many of us, is just knowing that we're not alone, that somebody else has experienced something like this. And it gives us so much hope and courage to be able to take those steps that we might be contemplating as well. So thank you for your bravery and sharing.
No, and thank you so much for letting me share with your listeners. And it's always lovely to talk to you.
Thank you again so much to Cait West for coming on the Sunday School Dropouts podcast. I really loved that conversation. And if you loved it too, I would encourage you to go ahead and purchase Cait's book, or rent it or check it out rather from your local library, or even listen to it on Audible. I just think it's so interesting how, so many of us grew up in these high control religions, and despite having some different practices and beliefs, there's so much of it that is all tied together. I didn't grow up in the stay-at-home daughters movement, as I noted in the interview, but it was something I was really familiar with, and something that I even kind of wished to be a part of, because I thought that this would be the thing that would bring me the godly husband and be able to fulfill my dreams of being a godly and submissive wife, and kind of would help me with the pinnacle of my existence to then also become a mother. And it's just so interesting, fascinating, really, to hear now the actual lived experience of somebody growing up in that environment, and how it wasn't a choice for her. It was the only option that she had. And so I just really admire Cait's openness and authenticity, not only in this interview, but in her story, in her book. And I would highly encourage anybody anywhere to just pay attention to the things that she's saying. And, you might find yourself in her story, and you might just learn a thing or two. Make sure to check out the show notes, where all of Cait's information, including her book, her social media links, and the digital short film For Our Daughters, will all be linked there. And I think with that, all God's people said, amen.